of the assessment. So mapping the natural capital assets, identifying dependencies, or essentially the ecosystem service flows, and we'll have an exercise there, and then we'll go on to the final step, which is really kind of using the assessment to understand what impacts a development corridor project might have. And then hopefully there'll be some time for question and answers. So there's quite a lot to cover conceptually here, and really the idea of this presentation is to introduce some of these concepts and provide you guys with some pointers on additional literature that you might want to go and look at if you want to get more detail on those. So onto the introduction, starting sort of really with the basics here. What is natural capital? So essentially we're talking about the stocks of natural resources here. These include fossil fuels, minerals, aggregates, sand, etc. But they also include the stock of ecosystem assets, and this is going to be where we focus today. So here's a definition from the ecosystem accounting community, where ecosystem assets are spatial areas that contain a combination of biotic and abiotic components and other characteristics that function together. So essentially these sort of functional units all come together through various processes and interactions to supply a flow of ecosystem services. And this definition is, very well aligned essentially to the CBD definition for ecosystems, and this idea that we're trying to communicate that ecosystem assets are essentially a functional unit at a location that's providing a flow of ecosystem services, for example, clean water to people. So natural capital provides many inputs into many production processes, and these are both in, formal economic activities, but also for supporting human well-being. However, these inputs have typically been taken for granted, kind of used for free, essentially, and there's been no reinvestment or minimal reinvestment by society to really ensure that we're maintaining our stocks of natural capital and securing the benefits it provides in the long term. And so this has led us into this kind of misallocation problem, where we haven't invested enough in our natural capital stocks, and we have facing a real threat to the benefits we derive from it, and this is now seen as a key threat to sustainable development. And the UK Treasury recently commissioned this to review, where the link is at the bottom of the screen there, and that provides a really kind of nice overview of this issue. Other important part of natural capital is loss of natural capital really tends to have a disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities, as these types of groups are particularly dependent on ecosystem services for their well-being. An example being the rural poor, and the T for policy publication in section 3.5 again provides quite a nice sort of summary of these kind of issues if you're interested in looking at a bit more. So here we're sort of trying to get to some kind of representation of what we want to do in the steps for the natural capital assessment. So you can see here on this map that we have these ecosystem assets essentially as patches of the same ecosystem type. And so within these ecosystem assets, we have these processes and functions, and then we have interactions also between the ecosystem assets. So we may have photosynthesis occurring, and that's going to go on and yield a flow of valuable ecosystem services, for example, crop provisioning, wild food and timber. And these ecosystem services are contributing to economic activities and human well-being, either directly or in conjunction with some other form of capital input. And broadly, we can see these ecosystem services arranged under three kind of headings. So one's provisioning, looking at these generally consumptive benefits, food, materials, and water. another regulating. So this is how ecosystems regulate the environment and make it a nice place for us to live in. So controlling floods, stabilizing soils, for instance. And then these cultural group of services, which are generally non-consumptive. So how we use ecosystems and nature for recreation, for example. And so here we have essentially this conceptual framework of the link between natural capital or ecosystem assets, services and benefits. So essentially we have these ecosystem assets on the left here, which are the stocks and enable a flow of ecosystem services. These ecosystem services in turn yield benefits, and these may often be secured with the help of other capital inputs such as human manufactured or social capital. And the idea of this returning supporting ecosystem services arrow is to capture this idea that ecosystem functions and processes are dependent on a sufficient amount of energy, nutrients, species interactions, fresh water, etc. So, for example, rivers need a minimum environmental water flow to function properly. So just taking an example of this in the context of ecosystem services for water supply, we have freshwater bodies as ecosystem assets, forests and wetlands that all contribute to that, and the services they're providing are water purification, regulation and provisioning. And then the supporting service is obviously maintaining our hydrological cycle. And then this yields clean water for drinking or agricultural or other potentially industrial activities. And to secure that, we may need to invest in a surface water abstraction and distribution systems. So that's the general idea of what we're looking at now. And I think you can sort of sketch that out as a conceptual link from the ecosystem asset through to some kind of relevant ecosystem processes or functions that yield the ecosystem service, which in turn leads to a benefit for people. And so as an example, we may have forests as the asset, photosynthesis as the ecosystem function, which yields a flow of biomass or provisioning services. And then from that, with investment in some harvesting technology, we can get timber for construction. At this point, we'll just sort of go into an overview on natural capital assessment before really looking at step one. So why do a natural capital assessment? Good question to sort of start with, really. And essentially what we're trying to do is provide an evidence base for evaluating the status of ecosystems and the benefits that they provide. So we want to understand really how natural capital in a study area is contributing to economic activities, livelihoods, and well-being. And we want to understand what the sector activities or developments that are going to be driving change in natural capital and affecting the benefits that it provides to people. And the whole point of doing this is to use that information to help us in a better integrated sort of land use decision-making process that's going to be more sustainable with respect to development. So how can we best mitigate the impacts of our decisions around land use and economic activities on natural capital, but also how can we get the benefits from natural capital integrated into our development planning, for example, through the use of nature-based solutions. And just reflecting really on progress in the area, in this area, the importance of natural capital is now becoming better understood through various initiatives. The system of environmental economic accounting, for instance, is the national natural capital accounting framework. There's also the World Bank Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services initiative, which is using the SEA and other valuation approaches to inform planning. There's the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity publications, and there's the IPBES process as well. So through these initiatives, there's kind of repositories of case studies and publications that may be useful to draw on when doing a natural capital assessment. But the approach we're going to look at is a kind of abridged four-step approach today. So defining the purpose and scale of the assessment is step one. Then on step two, we'll look at how we could map out natural capital stocks. And then in step three, identify dependencies on these stocks. So really, what are the ecosystem service flows that are benefiting people? And then assess impacts on natural capital from different development proposals. So really some sort of scenario analysis around the implications of different options for development corridor projects in this instance. This is broadly aligned with an approach that we did a couple of years ago for green economy transition as well. So there's a bit more detail in that publication at the bottom there also. So step one, defining the purpose and scale of the assessment. So really here we're trying to acknowledge this important point around decision-centered design. So this is a really important part of the natural capital assessment process. I think traditionally there's been a supply sort of side orientated approach to doing these kind of assessments. So these have tended to reflect the technical interests of those producing the assessment. But what we really want from the assessment is to provide the most relevant information in the most usable format to decision makers. So, you know, we want to understand what are the policy strategies or plans that are going to be most relevant to the natural capital assessment, and what are going to be the entry points from information from the assessment into informing those. Who are the key stakeholders around natural capital in the assessment process, and how are we going to get them engaged and involved in the assessment process, and then really understanding what are going to be the core needs of the users of the assessment, and that's going to really help inform specific goals for the natural capital assessment. So what we're trying to get to is a really clear pathway on how the assessment is going to support decision making and lead to improved outcomes for natural capital. And this idea of decision-centered design is quite nicely explored in this paper as well from the World Bank Waves web page. So to do that, we really need to confirm and validate the key goals for the assessment. So we need to engage with a wide range of stakeholders to reach agreement on these goals. So here we're really ensuring that the assessment is going to be relevant and useful. It will help to develop a plan to communicate progress and gather feedback from these stakeholders throughout the assessment process as much as possible. And this is really also going to help to not only steer the process, but also foster ownership of the assessment process and hopefully stimulate, you know, the uptake of the results of the assessment and get it into decision making. And also that stakeholder engagement process is a key part of helping to ensure that we have the best scientific information and approaches used in the assessment. So what we're really looking for is the assessment to be, you know, scientifically credible, which I think a lot of us obviously acknowledge, but also we need it to be a legitimate, you know, process that understands the different needs of people with respect to natural capital, and we also really want it to be relevant to users of the assessment. And if we can bring this all together, then we're likely to have a very impactful natural capital assessment product. So this leads us, okay. Yeah.
Great.
Good stuff. So on to step two. After step two, we'll take a 5-minute sort of stretch the legs and refocus break. So now we're kind of into the nuts and bolts of the technical work of how we structure the assessment for meeting our well-defined goals, objectives, and user needs. So we're looking at mapping ecosystem assets now and their condition. And so in order to really assist us with this mapping process, there are these four kind of broad principles that come out of the ecosystem accounting community that I think are quite useful. The first being is that the ecosystem assets that you map out, as far as possible, should be mapped out in a way that follows the CBD definition of ecosystem. So we're really looking at a dynamic complex of plant, animal, microorganism communities, and their non-living environment interacting as a functional unit. Easier said than done, but something that is quite important to be aware of. And of course, there's a pragmatic principle here that the ecosystem assets should be capable of being mapped. So the typology that you develop is implementable in practice to actually generate a spatial map of ecosystem assets in a study area. And then two principles around the mapping approach. Essentially, that the map should be geographically and conceptually exhaustive. So essentially what we're saying here is when you map out your ecosystem assets, there's no gaps between them. So there's no areas where you don't know what the ecosystem type is or are not covered by an ecosystem asset. And then the fourth principle is that these assets should be mapped out in a way that's geographically and conceptually exclusive, and by that we mean that ecosystem assets shouldn't overlap, so there should be no points or locations on the map that would be two different ecosystem types, if that makes sense. So no gaps and overlaps essentially is what those two principles at the end, 3 and 4, are saying. And there's some more information on that within the draft ecosystem accounting chapter for that. That's likely to be finalised in 2021. So at some point, this link will be won't be working anymore, and there'll be a final chapter to refer to in the final guidance for that framework. But then just thinking about how we'd go about developing these ecosystem maps for a study. So ideally, there'll be an existing national or local ecosystem or habitat map that describes the configuration of ecosystem assets for your study area. And then we're aligned to these four principles. If not, land cover maps can be used as a proxy for ecosystem types. Have a limited ecological meaningfulness, but they do satisfy principles 2 to 4. Then if you're feeling confident and have time, you may think about integrating different map products to really try and add a bit more ecological meaning to those land cover maps. So by using maps of land use, so you can understand where forestry areas might be. So harvested area of forest may not show up as a land cover map, even though it's a plantation. So that can be useful. There's a number of thematic maps for different ecosystem types, so forests, mangroves, open waters, etc., that may add more detail. You can use natural vegetation maps, so these can often be helpful where where you've got natural land cover from your land cover maps, and then you can perhaps get a bit more detail on what the type of vegetation community might be in those natural areas using those maps. Then there's more modelling-based approaches where you can use in situ monitoring data perhaps to interpolate the extent of different ecosystems, or potentially using more expert-based approaches to delineate ecosystems based on various spatial characteristics. But hopefully there is something existing that you can draw from. But just reflecting on that, your choice of how you actually delineate your ecosystems or your ecosystem assets or the mapping product, you use is important. It may be constrained by the data and the resources you have available, but where you do have multiple data products, it's important to look at these and be aware that they may provide you with different results. And we see 4 products here for Tanzania, where you can readily see that there's a different configuration of the same ecosystem assets in the landscape inferred from using a different product. So this is probably an important thing to make sure you get right with who you think is going to be using the assessment and your stakeholders in that. So here just some resources that might be helpful to draw on. So ideally, you have a local or national ecosystem or habitat map that's a good starting point and familiar to decision makers, or a similar land cover map that you can use as a proxy. And potentially add more ecological meaning to. And then here we have a list of global data sources that provide derived products that could also be used to generate a map of ecosystem assets in your study area. So moving now on to the idea of ecosystem conditions. So the idea of mapping the assets is to set out the boundaries for these different ecosystem assets, but in terms of the natural capital stocks that they represent, they're defined both on the basis of their extent, but also in terms of their quality as well. So the idea of ecosystem condition measurement is to also understand that quality aspect. So we're interested in measuring condition really in terms of its abiotic and biotic characteristics. And the condition or the quality of an ecosystem asset reflects its ability to function and in turn supply ecosystem services. So from the EU work on mapping and assessment of ecosystems and their services, the MAISE program, these sort of 5 key indicators, if you like, or groupings of different condition variables have come out. So you could look at pressures, so water abstraction rates or fishing effort or something similar. Physical indicators, so this would be things like soil sealing or fragmentation by roads, some kind of physical structural intervention. Then there'll be chemical indicators, so for instance looking at pollution concentrations in water bodies, and then have structural and compositional types of indicators that are sometimes split out, but structural indicators would be things like what's the canopy cover in a forest ecosystem asset, for example, and a compositional one would be maybe what's the species assemblage in a wetland, for example, or species diversity there, and is it declining or stable. And then the final one here is this idea of functional condition indicators. So these are indicators that communicate something on the processes that are happening in an ecosystem. So dry matter productivity over time or other types of vegetation indexes. So the easiest way to use this information on condition is really to review trends in condition metrics over time and try and draw some inferences on whether they're indicative of deterioration or degradation, and then potentially what that might mean for the delivery of certain ecosystem services. So for example, loss of soil fertility as a condition indicator would obviously provide some insight into likely loss of future crop provisioning services in agricultural ecosystem assets. It's a little bit harder to understand if ecosystem assets are in what we could say good condition, and this is going to require that a benchmark be determined. So this could be a historic point in time, and then this can be used to rescale the condition variables using their current value. So essentially normalizing them as some sort of index. And for example, the Living Planet uses 100 based on species populations in 1970 as the reference. Then if you're feeling really brave, you can go and rescale all of your condition variables using the same reference condition or benchmark and aggregate them all together to give essentially an overall composite indicator of ecosystem condition. This is clearly very challenging though. There's going to be a number of difficult decisions around what's the right reference condition to use and getting the benchmark values also for those reference conditions. And also a lot of information is lost when you go through this aggregation approach. So you really got to think about which composite indicators are really going to be meaningful and useful for decision making. But there's a couple of examples out there. Probably the best example is the Norwegian Nature Index, and the paper here has got a nice summary of that. And this framework or type of approach is also explored more deeply in this draft chapter on ecosystem condition for ecosystem accounting. One point to touch on that's important in the context of ecosystem condition is this idea of trying to build ecosystem resilience and also resilience in livelihoods that are supported by ecosystem services. And this has become quite an important theme in landscape kind of management plans and initiatives. And in this context, maintaining biodiversity is going to be important because diverse systems have different ecosystems and species that are going to perform similar functions and processes, but they're also going to respond to environmental change and shocks in different ways. So in this fashion, they can kind of substitute for each other when shocks or change come along, and yet the system can maintain the same level of overall ecosystem service supply. So basically, we can see, biodiversity being important to this supporting services role and keeping nutrients, energy, matter cycling within ecosystem processes and functions. And this also helps us stay, a safe distance from any tipping points where essentially ecosystems as a functional unit in its current state break down and move to some sort of different functional regime. And we look at that a bit more in the context of species accounting in this publication, if you're interested in this area. So just thinking about some of the resources for mapping ecosystem condition that might be out there. Where data exists for different ecosystem types, this could potentially then broadly be assigned to different ecosystems in a collective sense within your study area, or it could be assigned to distinct ecosystem assets or areas if it's supported by spatially referenced information, and various downscaling procedures could also be employed, making assumptions about how that information might be disaggregated. There are also a number of map products that you can use to then integrate with your map of ecosystem assets, and just set out some of the global products that we sometimes use here, and you can go and look at those if you're interested in applying any of those. But this is just a convenient set. It's not meant to be comprehensive. So I think that sort of takes us into step 3, where we'll look at the ecosystem service flows. I suggest we take 5 minutes at this point, a halfway stage.
Great. Before we take the 5-minute break, there's a quick question about that from Christine, Steve. Do you want to take that now?
What's the question? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Earlier on, when you were speaking about ecosystem assets, you said they shouldn't have gaps, and she has a clarification on that. What if in an urban, so what if it's a development corridor and there are urban areas as well? How do you then consider those in your map or analysis? And then Diego's also said, I was also going to ask if it applies for roads, railways, dams, etc. So when you say don't have gaps.
Yeah, so then you basically need to have an urban ecosystem type in the map, or a built up area or something like that to represent those types of things.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was the question that came up on chat. So maybe we will take that break.
Sorry.
No worries. Should we start off then? I hope everyone's had a little bit of a stretch and come back.
Sounds good.
I'll just ask in the chat.
And you're seeing step 3 on the share screen? Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, I hope I just asked in chat if you're back, you can just say yes. Oh. Great. Okay, I think we've got a few responses, and hopefully everyone else is back now as well. You can start off, Steve.
Okay, great. So hopefully everyone's feeling a bit more comfortable, and I've got a cup of coffee, so I'm happy. And we'll go into step 3 now. So this is really starting to look at the ecosystem service flows, essentially. So we're looking to identify what the dependencies are in our study area on natural capital, and understand how the configuration of ecosystem assets is benefiting people in the study area. So essentially, we're looking really to identify at this point, which economic activities are underpinned by ecosystem assets and the services they supply. Where are vulnerable beneficiaries that have a very high dependency or a high sensitivity on ecosystem assets and their services, and then how are the linkages between these different ecosystem assets, services, economic activities, and beneficiaries materialized in the landscape through these different ecosystem service flows. And at this point as well, it might be useful to reflect on which ecosystem assets might be considered as critical, or non-substitutable, and that might be useful when thinking about offsetting and similar types of things. So following step 2, hopefully now we have an understanding on our ecosystem assets, and hopefully some information on their condition that can be used to infer something on the potential for them to supply ecosystem services. But now essentially what we want to do is start building a picture of the relationships between ecosystems, ecosystem services, and beneficiaries for the assessment. So really start building a conceptual model of to help us map these ecosystem flows out. So, what's the supply from the different ecosystem assets, and what's the use of services by different economic units, and by these we mean different households, businesses, or sectors. So for an ecosystem service to exist, it's important it must be both supplied and used. It's not a flow if we don't have both of those things happening, supply and use. And some services may be supplied and used in the same place, and that's often the case with provisioning services. So these are things like wild foods, for example, or and some services may be supplied and used in different places, and this is often the case, with regulating services. So you may have flood control or storage in some upstream area that benefits people in a different spatial location. And chapter 5 in this publication at the bottom sets out quite a nice framework talking about service providing units and service benefiting areas as well, which provides a little bit more information on that kind of thinking. But just looking at a simple example here of where services are supplied and used in different areas. In the top panel here, we see these pink populated areas that are using water supplied by this river ecosystem asset. And then we've got forests upstream of that. In the bottom left B panel here, we can see that these forest ecosystem assets are providing a purification or filtering service that's actually delivering cleaner water into the river. But the benefit is actually realized in these areas that are directly downstream from the forest where the water's actually abstracted and used. And there's lots of sort of similar situations. For example, pollination services are often supplied by ecosystem assets around agricultural areas, and then nursery services are often supplied, for instance, by mangrove areas to open oceans and support the recruitment of commercial fish stocks, for instance. On step 3, one of the things that might be helpful is using some kind of formal ecosystem service classification system. So the idea here is it will help avoid double counting. It will help deal with some of the confusions around mistaking ecosystem processes for services, the linkages to direct users, and help you separate ecosystem service inputs from other inputs. And it also provides a kind of unifying language, so your assessment can be reused either for benefits transfer or in other contexts, such as aggregating over areas. So there's 3 kind of systems out there, CICES and Nexus, FEGS as well, and CICES is a classification system up here, so it's a hierarchical kind of classification, and this link to a document gives quite a nice overview on why it's sensible to use ecosystem service classification systems. So I'll leave that at that. Moving from conceptual to quantitative is going to be important fundamentally to the ecosystem, the natural capital assessment process. So there's a number of proprietary models for modeling ecosystem services and physical flows. We'll be running through Costing Nature and Water World this afternoon. Other approaches is the use of sort of lookup tables, so carbon sequestration rates for different ecosystem types. You can also look at national sector statistic reports and sort of disaggregate those to different ecosystem assets. So, for example, tourism visits to protected areas. And then there's some more expert knowledge type of approaches. And one of the things that's being used is this ecosystem service matrix. And this is very similar to the exercise that we just went through, but a bit more structured. And there's a paper to link to that too. Many decision makers will also be keen to have a monetary value for ecosystem service flows, and really the reason for this being helpful is they make explicit the value of the contributions of ecosystems to production processes, and this has been a key issue really. Not having those values made visible has led to this misallocation problem we touched on at the outset. They also allow comparisons of investments in ecosystem conservation or restoration against investments in other public goods, so returns on education, for instance. And they're useful for really better understanding the economic implications of ecosystem impacts from projects on a case-by-case basis, so we can look at economic benefits of project implementation versus the value of ecosystem service loss associated with it. And just to highlight, the values are really most meaningful, at the margins, plus or minus 10%, rather than, the whole lot, valuing all oxygen in the atmosphere, for instance. But you may also want to look at non-monetary metrics, so protein, jobs, clean water are also, very valuable in terms of the social implications of loss of those types of things. Just to highlight the system of environmental economic accounting as a sort of multi-purpose, scalable framework that really helps to harmonize different environmental data into some kind of consistent information. So that can be, you know, applied subnationally and nationally, and there's some links to these to the framework here at the bottom of the slide. So really, to move on to step 4, which is using the natural capital assessment. So the idea here is really we want to use the assessment to understand how natural capital and ecosystem services might change in the future compared to the baseline that we've established through steps 2 and 3. So essentially, how will the development corridor affect ecosystem services and biodiversity? You know, what are going to be the knock-on impacts to different economic activities, and which communities and livelihoods are likely to be affected by this? And are there any particularly vulnerable people that we need to be aware of and make mitigation measures for? So we're back to really informing this decision-making process now. So we want to use the natural capital assessment to help us understand what the best development options are, given our stakeholder interests in natural capital in this study area. So how can we deliver a project that's going to avoid or minimize impacts on natural capital and the benefits it provides? How are we going to protect those vulnerable communities? How can we also make best use of the ecosystem services that the natural capital is providing in terms of integrating nature-based solutions into the development? And are there going to be any residual impacts that we might want to think about offsetting as well? So replacing biodiversity loss somewhere else being a classic example. And within that, we may need to also consider what the additional effects of climate change might be. So just an example, this study here is really using natural capital assessment for a development corridor project, and it's using the assessment to do some trade-off analysis around maximizing agricultural benefits via transportation projects, but also minimizing their environmental costs. So really working out where the best compromises can be reached. A more generic example here from this publication is looking at natural capital assessment for roads as well. So, you know, where's the best location to build the road to avoid impacts on ecosystem services, and how can natural capital and ecosystem services be used to best reduce the risks to the road system. And again, another example here from South America, a bit more specific, where they use a natural capital assessment essentially to evaluate 75 different road development projects, and they identify social environmental costs associated with each project, and also the economic benefits they thought each project would deliver. And so that allowed them to identify a subset of projects that deliver mostly economic benefits, but also had a very low social and environmental cost. And finally, just a point on offsetting, really. Development projects are increasingly required to, you know, fully mitigate impacts on biodiversity. So essentially compensating any biodiversity loss by measures at another site. But one of the things, the layout of ecosystem assets in a study area, you're going to have some impacts on communities that are dependent on ecosystem services. So natural capital assessment can help ensure that there are no overall net loss to these types of communities. Okay, so sorry, had to speed up a bit through that last bit, but hopefully we still have some time for questions now.